John sat in the quiet of his suburban home, the faint laughter of his children filtering in through the open window. The late summer evening carried with it the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecues from nearby yards. It was the kind of moment that should have brought him peace. Instead, a heaviness settled in his chest. For weeks, John had noticed changes in Emily. At first, it had been subtle, a distracted look here, a quiet sigh there. But soon, the signs became harder to ignore. Her phone, once forgotten on counters or tucked into a purse, was now always within arm's reach. Notifications lit up the screen, followed by quick, discreet glances. She smiled less, laughed less, and when she did, it often felt forced, like a mask she was trying to hold in place. And then there was Matt. John's best friend had been part of their lives for years, a near constant presence at dinners, family events, and casual evenings on the porch. But recently, Matt's presence felt different, too familiar, too close. John began to notice the little things, the way Matt's hand lingered on Emily's shoulder during a joke, the shared glances across the room that seemed to hold a conversation of their own. He told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining it. But doubt crept in, whispering in the back of his mind, growing louder with each passing day. One evening, as Emily excused herself to bed early, her phone buzzed faintly on the kitchen counter. John glanced at it, and his heart skipped a beat. He had always respected Emily's privacy, never feeling the need to check her messages. But this time, something was different. His hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the phone. The screen lit up, revealing a message from Matt. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, smiley face." John stared at the words, the knot in his stomach tightening. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each more painful than the last. But instead of storming into the bedroom to confront Emily, he felt paralyzed. His emotions swirled, hurt, angry, confusion, but there was also a strange, insistent curiosity. In the days that followed, John began to observe Emily more closely. He noticed how she seemed to avoid eye contact when he asked about her plans, how she would retreat to their bedroom to answer calls or check messages. Each small detail added to the growing unease in his chest. Then came Saturday. Emily mentioned she had errands to run and left the house with her usual hurried smile. John waited a few minutes before grabbing his keys and following her. His heart pounded as he drove a few cars behind her, keeping enough distance to stay unnoticed. Emily pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town, and John parked farther away, watching as she entered. A few minutes later, Matt arrived. Through the window, John saw them sit at a corner table. Their heads leaned close together, and Emily's face lit up in a way John hadn't seen in years. They shared quiet laughter, their gestures relaxed and familiar. It was a sight that cut deep, but John couldn't bring himself to look away. As the days went on, John became consumed by what he had witnessed. He began to piece together Emily's movements, reconstructing moments that now felt like missing parts of a puzzle. He didn't confront her. Instead, he waited and watched, as though trying to understand the full scope of what was happening before deciding his next move. One evening, John unlocked Emily's phone again while she was in the shower. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages. Most were innocent, updates about the kids or work, but hidden among them were exchanges with Matt. They were playful, familiar, and unmistakably personal. A message from Matt from earlier that week read, "Last time was amazing. Can't wait to do it again soon." John's stomach churned, but the anger he expected didn't come. Instead, he felt a cold clarity, as though he had always known but refused to see it. And yet, as undeniable as the truth was, a strange part of him still couldn't walk away. The following days were a blur. John felt like an outsider in his own life, quietly observing as Emily continued her routines. He noticed how she smiled at her phone, how her laughter with Matt felt effortless compared to the strained conversations they shared at home. One evening, as the kids slept and Emily retreated early to their bedroom, John sat on the porch, nursing a drink. The stars twinkled faintly overhead, and the distant hum of sprinklers filled the air. He thought about the life they had built, the years they had shared, and the slow unraveling of it all. He should have been furious, should have confronted Emily and Matt, demanded answers. But as he stared out into the night, he realized something deeper was at play. Somewhere along the way, he and Emily had lost the connection that once bound them together. This realization didn't absolve her actions, but it forced John to reflect on his own role in their distance. John made a decision that night. Instead of lashing out in anger, he resolved to find clarity not just about Emily and Matt, but about himself, about their marriage, and about what had brought them to this point. He didn't know if their relationship could be saved, but he knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. There was no mistaking it now. This was where it was happening. John parked a safe distance away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if holding on for stability. He watched as Emily got out of her car, glancing around nervously before walking into the small, nondescript hotel. The sight made his heart pound in a chaotic rhythm, a storm of emotions swirling within him: anger, confusion, disbelief, and something he couldn't yet name. Moments later, Matt's car pulled up. John clenched his jaw as he watched his best friend casually step out, looking as though this were just another day. Matt adjusted his jacket and walked inside the same hotel. John's breath hitched in his throat. His first instinct was to storm in, to confront them, to demand answers in a scene of dramatic intensity. But something stopped him. A quieter, darker voice inside whispered, "Not yet." Instead, he stayed in the car, his pulse racing and his mind spinning with thoughts he couldn't fully process. He told himself he needed to see more, to understand everything before acting. That night, John drove home in silence. The weight of guilt that he had expected never came. Instead, there was only a strange sense of detachment, almost liberation, as though by witnessing their actions, he had freed himself from some invisible tether. He replayed the evening in his mind, over and over, dissecting every detail. Emily and Matt had no idea he had been there, watching their secret unfold. And that gave him a sense of power he hadn't felt in years. The following days blurred into a surreal routine. Outwardly, everything remained the same. Emily smiled at him during dinner, spoke warmly to the children, and kissed him goodnight with the same casual affection she always had. But for John, nothing was the same. Every glance, every word, every shared moment now carried an undercurrent of hidden meaning. He didn't see her as just his wife anymore. She had become a mystery, a figure he observed with a detached fascination. This growing obsession began to consume him. The need to see more, to know more, drove him to actions he would have once found unthinkable. John began to set up cameras in their home, discreetly hidden in places Emily would never notice. It wasn't just about catching her anymore, it was about feeding the strange, twisted compulsion that had taken root inside him. The footage became his escape. Late at night, when the house was silent, John would sit alone, watching the recordings. He studied Emily's movements, her expressions, the way she interacted with Matt when they thought no one was watching. The anger that had once burned inside him had dulled to something quieter, something more complicated. He should have felt betrayed, but instead, he felt curiosity. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave the house under the guise of meeting a friend, John followed her again. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he kept a safe distance behind her car. When she pulled into the parking lot of the same hotel, John parked in the shadows, his heart racing as he watched her step out and enter. Minutes later, Matt arrived. John's stomach churned as he saw them greet each other with a familiarity that spoke volumes. They didn't linger outside, quickly disappearing through the door. John stayed in his car, his breath shallow, torn between the desire to storm in and the strange compulsion to remain an observer. That night, as he sat in his dimly lit living room, replaying the events in his mind, a realization struck him. It wasn't just Emily and Matt's actions that held his attention, it was his own response to them. He wasn't driven by anger anymore. Instead, there was a darker pull, a need to understand, to explore the boundaries of what he thought he knew about himself, his marriage, and his life. Days turned into weeks. John's quiet observation continued, and with it, his understanding of himself began to shift. He no longer saw their actions as a betrayal but as a revelation of their relationship's cracks, of desires left unspoken, and of the person he had become. One evening, John sat Emily down, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak words he had rehearsed countless times. "Emily," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "I know about you and Matt." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John met her gaze, his expression calm. "I've known for a while," he said softly. And I've been watching. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she processed his words. Watching? John nodded. I've seen everything. And I'm not angry. In fact, I want to talk about it. Not to accuse you, but to understand. To see if there's something here we can figure out together. The room filled with silence, thick and heavy. Emily's eyes searched his face, as if looking for some sign of what he truly meant. Slowly, she nodded, her voice shaking as she said, I don't know what to say, John. We'll figure it out, he replied, reaching for her hand. I just want us to be honest, no matter where it leads. The first touch was hesitant. Emily reached out, her hand brushing against John's knee, as if searching for a connection that had once been there but had since grown distant. John felt a shiver run through him, not of fear, but of something unexpected, a raw and unfiltered emotion that he couldn't fully place. His eyes met hers, and in that brief exchange, the weight of their shared history seemed to fall away, leaving only the uncertainty of the moment. Matt sat nearby, his gaze steady, as though waiting for an unspoken signal. John's slight nod was enough. Matt leaned forward, placing a hand lightly on Emily's shoulder. The energy in the room shifted, the air thick with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. John realized they were stepping into the unknown, a place where the boundaries of their relationships would be tested. What followed was a convergence of emotions, confusion, curiosity, and a strange sense of liberation. John watched as Emily's demeanor softened, as she let herself embrace a moment of vulnerability and closeness that had been absent from their lives for so long. Yet, what struck John most was his own reaction. Instead of the jealousy or anger he thought he would feel, there was something else, an acceptance that this moment, strange and uncharted, was reshaping them all. By the end of the evening, the room had grown quiet again, the intensity ebbing away like the tide. Emily lay resting, her breathing steady, her expression peaceful in a way John hadn't seen in years. Matt sat quietly on the edge of the couch, his expression thoughtful. John stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't feel regret that surprised him most. What he felt instead was a tentative sense of clarity, as though a door they had all feared to open now revealed something unexpected. As days passed, the event became an unspoken part of their shared lives. Matt continued to visit, but now, there was a transparency that hadn't existed before. There were no secrets, no hidden glances or whispered excuses. For John, this openness was freeing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He no longer had to watch from the shadows or wonder what was happening. He was part of it, fully aware, fully present. Yet, as time wore on, John began to sense something shifting inside himself. The man he had been before, defined by stability, by control, felt distant, as if he belonged to another life. The thrill that had once driven him was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet emptiness that gnawed at him in the stillness of the night. One evening, John found himself sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, a drink in hand, staring at nothing in particular. The silence of the house pressed in on him, and his thoughts turned inward. He had crossed lines he once thought unthinkable, embraced parts of himself he hadn't known existed. But now, he was left wondering what it had all meant. The next morning, as he sat across from Emily at the breakfast table, John looked at her with fresh eyes. She smiled at him as she always did, her expression warm but tinged with a quiet uncertainty. He realized that they had both changed in ways neither fully understood. Emily, he said softly, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. She glanced up, sensing the weight in his tone. What is it? John hesitated, then spoke the words that had been circling in his mind. I don't think I can do this anymore. Emily froze, her face a mixture of surprise and recognition. Do what? She asked, though her voice betrayed that she already knew the answer. This, John said, gesturing vaguely. Everything. Us, Matt, all of it. I thought I wanted this. I thought it would give me something I needed. But now, I don't know who I am anymore. Emily's eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. John, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her gently. It's not your fault, he said quickly. I was the one who pushed for this, the one who thought this would fix everything. But now, I just feel lost. I don't even know who I am anymore. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she nodded slowly. "I've felt it too," she admitted. "The change. The distance." "What do we do now?" she asked after a long pause, her voice trembling. Jean reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We figure it out," he said. "Not with Matt. Not with anything else. Just us. We need to find ourselves again. Together." Emily stared at him for a long moment before nodding, her tears falling freely. "I don't want to lose us," she whispered. "You won't," John said softly. "But we have to rebuild. And that starts with finding who we are without all of this." In the quiet that followed, John felt a fragile sense of hope begin to take root. They couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the choices they had made. But they could choose what came next.